The crystal chandeliers of Riverside Country Club cast a warm glow over the elegant dining room, where the soft murmur of congratulatory conversations filled the air. It was the kind of evening that should have been perfect. My grandson Ben had just graduated from Harvard Law School with highest honors, and our family had gathered to celebrate this momentous achievement. Ben sat at the head of our table, his young face radiant with the confidence that comes from conquering the world at 22. He'd traded his cap and gown for a sharp navy suit that made him look every inch the successful attorney he was destined to become. The pride swelling in my chest felt almost too large for my 77-year-old ribs to contain. "Grandma Maggie." Ben leaned toward me, his brown eyes bright with excitement. "Did you see Professor Morrison's face during my speech? I think I actually moved him to tears." I squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses he'd earned from working construction during summers to help pay his way through school. "You've always had a gift with words. Sweetheart, your grandfather would have been so proud." That's when the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. "Oh, please." The voice cut through our moment like a blade through silk. "Let's not pretend this is some fairy tale success story." All heads turned toward Victoria Vicky, as she insisted we call her my daughter-in-law, who sat rigid in her chair with that particular smile she reserved for moments when she planned to draw blood. Her perfectly manicured fingers gripped her wine glass so tightly I worried it might shatter. "Vicky," my son Mike warned quietly, but she was already past the point of restraint. She stood slowly, deliberately, her designer dress catching the chandelier light as she turned to face me. The conversations at nearby tables began to fade as people sensed the shift in our corner of the room. "You want to know what I really think about this whole charade?" Her voice carried just enough to reach the adjacent tables, where familiar faces from our social circle turned with barely concealed curiosity. "This woman," she pointed directly at me, "has been playing the devoted grandmother act for years, but the truth is she's nothing but an embarrassment to this family." My stomach dropped, but I kept my face carefully neutral. I'd learned long ago not to give Vicky the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. "Mom, stop." Mike's voice held a note of desperation I'd heard too many times before, but Vicky was just getting started. She took a step closer to my chair, her voice rising with each word. "You want to know what your precious grandmother really is. Ben, she's a fraud. A pathetic old woman who can't even dress appropriately for her own grandson's graduation dinner." I glanced down at my navy dress, conservative, well-tailored, appropriate for the occasion, but I knew this wasn't really about my clothes. "You embarrass me," Vicky continued, her voice now carrying to half the dining room. "Every single time we're in public together, I have to pretend that you're not a complete social disaster. You say the wrong things. You dress like you shop at thrift stores, and you have no idea how to conduct yourself around people who matter." The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on our table, could practically hear the whispered conversations that would dominate the country club for weeks to come. Ben's face had gone pale. "Vicky, that's enough," Mike said firmly. "No, it's not enough." She turned back to me, and for a moment, I saw something in her eyes that went beyond mere dislike. It was contempt, pure and simple. "I have carried the embarrassment of being associated with you for 15 years. 15 years of making excuses, of trying to minimize the damage you cause just by existing in our lives." She leaned down closer to me, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more violent than her shouting. "You disgust me. Margaret, I look at you and I feel sick to my stomach that you're supposed to be family." The words hit me like physical blows, but something strange happened in that moment. Instead of the shame and hurt I might have expected to feel, a calm settled over me, a peaceful, almost pleasant calm that I'd been nurturing for exactly 6 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days. I smiled. It wasn't a big smile, Nothing dramatic or obvious. Just a small, satisfied curve of my lips that seemed to confuse Vicky more than any tears or protests might have. I reached into my purse with steady hands and pulled out my phone. With deliberate movements, I caught the eye of Rob, our usual waiter, and gave him the subtlest of nods. "What are you doing?" Vicky demanded, some of her confidence wavering as she noticed my composure. I didn't answer. Instead, I watched as Rob moved to the small control panel near the bar where the restaurant's audio-visual system was managed. The soft jazz that had been playing faded out, replaced by the distinctive sound of a video beginning to play. The large flat-screen television mounted on the far wall, usually displaying the club's weekly events calendar, flickered to life with a different image entirely. Vicky turned toward the screen, and I watched the color drain from her face like water flowing down a drain. "No," she whispered, but yes. There she was, crystal clear in high definition, sitting in what was clearly a lawyer's office. The timestamp showed a date from just 18 months ago. "So, you want to completely sever all ties?" The lawyer's voice came through the restaurant's sound system with perfect clarity. "Completely," Vicky replied on screen. "I don't want her to have any legal claim to contact or visitation. As far as I'm concerned, I never had a daughter." This was just the beginning, just the trailer, you might say. For the main feature, I'd been preparing for months. 6 months earlier. I had been arranging flowers in my kitchen when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. But at my age, unexpected visitors usually meant either someone selling something I didn't need or a neighbor with gossip I probably didn't want to hear. The man at my door looked nothing like what I'd expected a private investigator would look like. James Sullivan was in his 50s, wearing a simple gray suit that had seen better days, carrying a worn leather briefcase that suggested he'd been in this business for a long time. His handshake was firm but gentle, and his eyes held the kind of weariness that comes from seeing too much of humanity's darker side. "Mrs. Caldwell?" His voice was careful, professional. "I believe you're expecting me." I had hired him 3 weeks earlier after a conversation with my neighbor Helen that had planted a seed of suspicion I couldn't shake. She'd mentioned seeing Vicky at a law office downtown, which seemed odd since Vicky had never mentioned any legal matters to the family. "Helen's cousin works as a receptionist there," she'd said. "Family law practice. Please come in." I led him to my kitchen table, the same table where I'd made the call to hire him, my hands trembling as I dialed the number I'd found online. Jim set his briefcase on the table and opened it with practiced efficiency. "I have to tell you, Mrs. Caldwell, what I found was more extensive than what you originally asked me to investigate." My stomach tightened. I'd asked him to look into why Vicky might be visiting a lawyer. I hadn't prepared myself for extensive. "Before I show you anything," he continued, pulling out a thick manila folder, "I need you to understand that once you see this, you can't unsee it. Sometimes ignorance really is bliss." I looked at the folder, then back at his weathered face. "Mr. Sullivan, I've been married twice, buried one husband, and survived raising 3 children largely on my own. I've learned that the truth, no matter how ugly, is always better than living with a beautiful lie." He nodded slowly and opened the folder. The first document was a legal petition dated 18 months earlier. As I read the header, my vision actually blurred for a moment. Petition for termination of parental rights, voluntary surrender. "She has another daughter," Jim said quietly. "Emma Carter. She's 23 now." My hands started shaking before I'd finished reading the first paragraph. Vicky had voluntarily terminated her parental rights to a daughter from a previous relationship, not because she was young and unprepared, not because of financial hardship. The petition clearly stated she was terminating her rights because she was moving forward with a new family unit and wished to avoid complications. "There's more," Jim said, and I wasn't sure I could handle more. The next document was a report from a social worker. Emma had been 15 when Vicky abandoned her, left in the care of an elderly grandmother who died just 2 years later. The girl had aged out of the foster system with no family support, no college fund, no safety net of any kind. Where is she now? My voice came out as barely a whisper. Working 2 jobs in downtown Portland, trying to finish community college. She's been completely on her own since she was 17. I stared at the photo Jim handed me. Emma had Ben's eyes, the same warm brown that came from Mike's side of the family. She had Vicky's delicate bone structure, but there was something in her expression that was entirely her own, a weariness, a strength that spoke of someone who'd learned too young that the world could be a cold and unforgiving place. She doesn't know about your family. Jim continued. As far as Emma is concerned, her mother disappeared from her life and never looked back. She has no idea that Vicky remarried and had the life that Emma never got to have. The room felt like it was spinning. I gripped the edge of the table, trying to process what I was learning. How did you find all this? Public records. Mostly, court documents are accessible if you know where to look. I also spoke to some people who knew them before Vicky left Portland. He paused, seeming to weigh his words. Mrs. Caldwell, there's something else you need to know about why she left. I wasn't sure I could take another revelation, but I nodded for him to continue. Emma was getting too old, too independent, starting to ask questions about her father, wanting to know more about her mother's past. According to her former neighbors, Vicky seemed to view Emma as a liability rather than a daughter, someone who might interfere with her plans to start fresh. The words hit me like physical blows. I thought about Ben, about how much love and pride Vicky showed him in public. Had that all been performance? Was she capable of loving any child, or was Ben just young enough still to be useful to her image? There's video, Jim said quietly. Video. I was able to obtain footage from the law office security cameras. Your daughter-in-law was very explicit about her intentions and her feelings toward Emma during her meeting with the attorney. That's when he handed me the USB drive that would change everything. I watched it that night, alone in my living room with the curtains drawn and the door locked. Watching Vicky sit in that lawyer's office and speak about her own daughter with such cold detachment made me physically ill. She talked about Emma like she was disposing of an unwanted piece of furniture. But it was more than just the abandonment that horrified me. It was the calculation behind it. Vicky had researched the legal process thoroughly. She'd made sure there would be no way for Emma to contact her in the future, no way for her past to interfere with her new life with Mike and Ben. She had erased her own daughter with the same casual efficiency that someone might delete old files from a computer. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Emma working 2 jobs, putting herself through school with no family support. I thought about Ben, the grandson Vicky doted on so publicly, and wondered what would happen if he ever became inconvenient to her image. But mostly, I thought about my son Mike, who had no idea he'd married a woman capable of abandoning her own child. Over the following weeks, I had Jim continue his investigation. What he found was a pattern that made my blood run cold. Vicky had done this before, not abandoned children. Emma was her only child before Mike, but she had systematically isolated herself from anyone who knew her past, anyone who might contradict the image she wanted to project. Former friends, distant relatives, even her own mother, all cut off without explanation once they were no longer useful to her carefully constructed persona. I discovered that Emma was struggling, but determined, working as a night shift security guard and a weekend barista to pay for her classes. She lived in a studio apartment that cost most of her income, but she was making it work through sheer force of will. My daughter-in-law was not just selfish or self-centered. She was a predator who specialized in emotional manipulation, and my family was her current hunting ground. I spent weeks agonizing over what to do with this information. Should I tell Mike immediately? Should I contact Emma? Should I confront Vicky directly? But then I remembered something my first husband used to say. The best way to catch a liar is to let them keep talking. So I waited. I watched. I documented. And I started planning for the day when Vicky would finally reveal her true nature to everyone who mattered. I didn't have to wait long. The video continued playing as Vicky lay slumped in her chair, her head resting on the white tablecloth like she'd simply decided to take a nap in the middle of her own destruction. The restaurant staff had moved quickly to clear the nearby tables, but not quickly enough to prevent half the country club from witnessing my daughter-in-law's most carefully guarded secret. On screen, Vicky's voice continued with that same cold detachment I'd heard when Jim first played this recording for me. I don't want her to be able to find me ever, as far as the world is concerned. Emma Carter is not my daughter. Mike sat frozen in his chair, staring at the screen like he was watching a foreign film without subtitles. His face had gone through several color changes in the past few minutes, from confusion to shock to something approaching horror. "Dad?" Ben's voice was small, uncertain. "Who is Emma Carter?" Before Mike could answer, Vicky's eyes fluttered open. She lifted her head slowly, mascara smudged beneath her eyes, looking around the dining room like she couldn't quite remember where she was. Then her gaze landed on the television screen, and reality crashed back into her face like a physical blow. "Turn it off," she whispered, then louder, more frantic. "Turn it off." She struggled to her feet, swaying slightly, and lunged toward the television controls, but Rob, our waiter, stepped smoothly between her and the screen. He looked to me, and I gave him the slightest shake of my head. "Please." Vicky turned to face our table, her perfectly styled hair now disheveled, her designer dress wrinkled from her collapse. This is out of context. You don't understand. Then explain it to us." My voice was calm, steady, the voice of someone who'd had months to prepare for this moment. "Who is Emma Carter?" But even as I asked the question, I knew this was just the beginning of my strategy. The video they'd just seen was carefully edited, a preview, if you will, of the full evidence I'd compiled. I had hours of footage, dozens of documents, and a complete timeline of Vicky's deception. Tonight was just Act 1. The question hung in the air like smoke. I could feel the weight of dozens of conversations that had stopped mid-sentence, the electricity of social drama that would be dissected in living rooms across the city for months to come. Vicky's voice cracked. She looked desperately at Mike, searching his face for some sign that he might still be on her side. "She's my daughter from before I met your father." "Your daughter." Mike's voice was flat, emotionless. "You have a daughter. Had." Vicky corrected quickly. "I had a daughter. It was a long time ago, before you and I got together. It was complicated. Mike, you don't understand what my life was like then." On screen, the lawyer's voice continued the conversation we were all hearing for the first time. "And you're certain you want to include the clause preventing any future contact. This is quite permanent. Miss Hamilton?" "Completely certain," Vicky's recorded voice replied. "I want a clean slate. No complications from my past." Ben pushed his chair back from the table. "How old was she when you did this?" Vicky's eyes darted between her son and her husband. "She was 15, but you have to understand, 15. The word exploded from Mike like he'd been punched in the stomach. "You abandoned a 15-year-old. The video ended then, replaced by the club's usual events calendar. But the damage was done, around us. I could see phones being discreetly raised as people captured what they could of our family drama. By tomorrow morning, this story would be spreading through every social media platform and country club in the city. But I knew Vicky well enough to understand that she wouldn't go down without a fight, and I was right. The first shot in Vicky's counterattack came exactly 48 hours after the restaurant incident, delivered in the form of a heartbroken phone call from my youngest daughter. Rebecca, who lived 3 states away. "Mom, what's going on?" Rebecca's voice was tight with concern. "Vicky called me this morning, crying. She said you've been trying to destroy her marriage for months." I was in my garden, deadheading roses in the early morning quiet when my phone rang. The peace of the morning shattered with my daughter's words, and I sat down heavily on my garden bench. She said, "What?" "She told me you hired someone to spy on her, that you ambushed her at Ben's graduation dinner with some kind of setup. Mom, she was sobbing. She said you're trying to turn the whole family against her because you've never accepted her." The careful way Rebecca spoke told me everything I needed to know. Vicky had gotten to her first, had painted herself as the victim and me as the villain. I could practically hear the script my daughter-in-law had used, probably the same one she was spreading to anyone who would listen. "Rebecca, there's more to this story than what Vicky told you. I know you two have never gotten along perfectly, but Mom, she said you violated her privacy. She said you had her followed." There was a pause, and when Rebecca spoke again, her voice was smaller. "Did you really do that?" I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of having to defend actions that shouldn't need defending. "Yes, I did, but not for the reason she told you." "Then why? How do you explain to your daughter that her brother's wife is a predator? How do you tell her that the woman who's been part of family gatherings for 15 years casually abandoned her own child? She has another daughter, Rebecca, a daughter she abandoned when the girl was 15 years old." Silence on the other end of the line. Then, quietly, "What? Her name is Emma. She's 23 now, working 2 jobs to put herself through community college with no family support because Vicky legally severed all ties with her. She made sure Emma could never contact her again." Another long pause. "Are you sure? I have court documents, video recordings, everything." But even as I said it, I could hear the doubt creeping into Rebecca's voice. "Mom, that seems extreme, even for someone you don't like. Are you sure you're not misunderstanding something?" And there it was. The seed Vicky had planted was already taking root. My own daughter was questioning my judgment, my motives, my version of events. This was how Vicky operated. I was learning. She didn't just abandon people, she systematically destroyed their credibility first, making sure that when the truth came out, it would be dismissed as the vindictive lies of someone with an agenda. After I hung up with Rebecca, I sat in my garden for a long time, watching the sun climb higher in the sky and thinking about warfare. Most people think battles are won with dramatic gestures, big moments of triumph. But Vicky understood something more sophisticated. She knew that the most effective way to win a war was to make your enemy defeat themselves. By the time my neighbor Helen came by for our usual afternoon tea, I'd received similar calls from 2 cousins, Mike's sister Amanda, and even Ben's girlfriend Ashley. All of them had heard some version of the same story poor Vicky, victimized by a bitter mother-in-law who couldn't accept that her son had found happiness. "I don't want to take sides," Helen said carefully as she settled into my kitchen chair with her cup of Earl Grey. "But people are talking, Margaret, and some of what they're saying, well, it doesn't make you look very good." "What exactly are they saying?" Helen shifted uncomfortably. "That you've been jealous of Vicky from the beginning, that you resented how happy she made Mike, how perfect their family seemed. They're saying you hired that investigator to dig up dirt on her, and when you couldn't find anything really damaging, you took things out of context to make her look bad." Out of context? I couldn't keep the edge out of my voice. "Helen, she abandoned her 15-year-old daughter. She legally erased her own child. How is that out of context?" "Well," Helen said slowly, "according to what I heard, the girl was troubled, acting out, maybe getting into drugs, and Vicky was young and scared and thought the girl would be better off with other family members who could handle her better." I stared at my oldest friend, watching her repeat Vicky's lies with the conviction of someone who wanted to believe them. Where did you hear that version? Vicky called me yesterday. She was so upset. Margaret. She said she'd been planning to tell Mike about Emma when the time was right, but you forced her hand by making it public. She said the whole situation was more complicated than it looked. Of course, Vicky had called Helen. She was working her way through my entire support system, rewriting history conversation by conversation. The really masterful part was how she'd positioned my investigation as the real betrayal, by focusing on my violation of privacy rather than what that investigation had uncovered. She'd made me the villain in my own story. That evening, Mike called. "Mom, we need to talk." His voice was careful, controlled in a way that made my stomach clench. This wasn't the voice of a son calling his mother. This was the voice of someone who'd been convinced he needed to manage a difficult situation. "Of course. Sweetheart, do you want to come over for dinner? Actually, I think it would be better if we met somewhere neutral. How about that coffee shop on Elm Street tomorrow at 2 Bassesi neutral? As if I were some kind of threat that needed to be contained in a public space." The next afternoon, I arrived at the coffee shop 15 minutes early and chose a table in the back corner where we could talk privately. Mike walked in exactly at 2. And the way he moved purposeful, resigned, told me this wasn't going to be the conversation I'd hoped for. He sat down across from me without ordering anything, his hands folded on the table like he was preparing to deliver bad news. "Mom, I've been doing a lot of thinking since graduation night." "I imagine you have. The thing is, what you did having Vicky investigated, ambushing her in public like that, it wasn't right. No matter what you found out, that wasn't the way to handle it." I felt something cold settle in my chest. "And what would have been the right way?" "You should have come to me privately. We could have talked about it as a family, worked through whatever issues you had with my wife." "Issues I had," I repeated carefully. "Mike, this isn't about me not liking Vicky. This is about her abandoning her own child. According to Vicky, the situation with Emma was more complicated than what you saw in that video. She said she was trying to do what was best for a troubled teenager, and that you deliberately took her words out of context to make her look as bad as possible." There it was, the rewritten history, delivered by my own son with the earnest conviction of someone who desperately wanted to believe it. "Did she also tell you that Emma has been working 2 jobs to survive, that she has no family support system at all?" Mike's jaw tightened. "She told me that Emma chose to cut off contact with the family, that she was angry about the custody situation and refused to accept help. And you believe that—" "I believe my wife," he said firmly. "And frankly, Mom, the fact that you went to such lengths to dig up her past makes me question your motives." I stared at my son, seeing Vicky's handiwork written across his face like graffiti. She'd taken his natural loyalty and twisted it into a weapon against me. But then something happened that I hadn't expected. As Mike continued to defend his wife, his phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it absently, then froze. "What is it?" I asked. He looked up at me with confusion in his eyes. "It's from Ben. He says someone named Emma Carter is trying to reach me through LinkedIn. She says she's Vicky's daughter and she wants to talk." I felt my pulse quicken. This wasn't part of my plan. I hadn't contacted Emma yet. I'd been waiting for the right moment, the right strategy. "She found us," Mike said quietly, staring at his phone. Vicky's daughter found us. And just like that, the game had changed completely. 3 days later, I was making dinner for 1 when the doorbell rang. It was nearly 7 in the evening, and I wasn't expecting anyone. Since the graduation dinner incident, my social calendar had become notably lighter as people in my circle tried to navigate the awkward waters of choosing sides in a family drama they didn't fully understand. When I opened the door, I found myself face to face with a young woman who took my breath away. She had Mike's eyes and Vicky's delicate bone structure, but there was something in her expression that was entirely her own, a quiet strength mixed with nervous determination. "Mrs. Caldwell." Her voice was soft but steady. "My name is Emma Carter. I think we need to talk." My legs nearly gave out. After months of investigating her life from a distance, seeing her standing on my doorstep felt surreal, like a character from a book had stepped into reality. "Emma," I gripped the doorframe to steady myself. "How did you find me?" "It wasn't easy." She shifted a worn backpack on her shoulder. "But when your son's name starts appearing in news articles about a family drama at the Riverside Country Club, and when people start reaching out to me on social media asking if I'm related to Victoria Hamilton Caldwell, you start putting pieces together." Of course, in the age of smartphones and social media, nothing stayed private for long. Someone at the restaurant had undoubtedly posted about our scene, and the internet had done what it does best, connected the dots. "I know this is strange," she continued, "but I drove down from Portland because I had to understand what was happening, what I learned." She paused, her voice catching slightly. "What I learned changed everything I thought I knew about my life." I stepped aside to let her in, my mind racing. "Please come in. Can I get you something to eat? You must be tired from the drive." "Coffee would be great, if you have it." As I busied myself making coffee, Emma stood in my kitchen, looking around with curious eyes. She was smaller than I'd expected from Jim's photos, probably barely 5'3", but there was a presence about her that filled the room. "So, you're Vicky's mother-in-law," she said finally. "I am, and you're her daughter." Apparently, the word came out bitter, though I spent the last 8 years believing she was dead. I nearly dropped the coffee pot. "What?" Emma sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where Jim had first shown me the documents that exposed Vicky's lies. "When I aged out of foster care, I tried to find her. I hired a cheap investigator with money I'd saved from my first job." The coffee maker gurgled in the silence that followed her words. I felt like I was drowning in the enormity of what she was telling me. "He came back and told me my mother had died in a car accident 2 years earlier," Emma continued. "He showed me a death certificate and everything. Said he'd tracked down her last known address and found records of her death. I grieved for her, Mrs. Caldwell. I spent 3 years going to therapy to work through my feelings about losing a mother I'd barely known. But she wasn't dead," I said quietly. "No. She was here, playing happy family with your son and grandson while I was working night shifts to pay for community college classes." Emma's voice was steady, but I could see her hands trembling slightly around her coffee cup. "Do you know what it's like to find out that your mother not only abandoned you, but paid someone to make you believe she was dead?" The room spun slightly as the full scope of Vicky's cruelty hit me. It wasn't enough for her to abandon Emma. She'd had to make sure the girl could never find her, never disrupt her new life. "How did you find out the truth?" Social media, ironically. After the restaurant incident made local news, people started tagging me in posts, asking if I was related. I started digging, and eventually found someone who remembered my mother from Portland. They told me she'd moved here, married your son. The rest I pieced together from public records and news articles. Emma's revelation was staggering, but what struck me most was her composure. This young woman had discovered that her entire understanding of her life was built on a lie. Yet she'd driven 4 hours to confront the truth rather than hiding from it. "Emma," I said carefully, "what do you want from this? What are you hoping to accomplish?" She met my eyes steadily. "I want to understand why. I want to know what kind of person fakes their own death to avoid their child. And—" She hesitated. "I want to make sure my half-brother knows what he's dealing with. That's when Emma told me something that changed everything I thought I knew about Vicky's motivations. "Mrs. Caldwell, there's something else you need to know about my mother. Something I remembered after I started investigating her new life." Emma reached into her backpack and pulled out a manila folder, much like the one Jim had shown me months earlier, but these documents were different, older, more personal. "I had an older brother," she said quietly. "His name was Marcus. He would have been 26 now." My breath caught. Would have been... He died when I was 12 and he was 15. A car accident, but not the kind you're thinking. Emma's voice grew steady, clinical, like she was reciting facts to distance herself from the pain. "Marcus was walking home from school because our mother had forgotten to pick him up. Again, it was raining, and he tried to cross a busy street. A driver couldn't stop in time." The implications hit me like a physical blow. She was supposed to pick him up. She was supposed to pick both of us up. She'd been drinking that afternoon, not unusual for her back then. She'd passed out on the couch and forgot about us entirely. When the police came to tell her about Marcus, they found her unconscious. She had to be woken up to be told her son was dead. Emma pulled out a newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. The headline read, "Teen dies in traffic accident." Below it was a photo of a young boy who looked remarkably like Ben. After Marcus died, everything changed. My mother became obsessed with appearing perfect, with never making mistakes. She stopped drinking, started going to therapy, joined support groups, but she also became cold, controlling, like she was trying to prevent any situation where she might fail again. I stared at the newspaper clipping, understanding flooding through me. She blamed herself for Marcus's death. Of course she did, because it was her fault. Emma's voice was matter-of-fact, without malice. But instead of dealing with that guilt in a healthy way, she decided the solution was to never be vulnerable again, never be in a position where someone could depend on her and be let down. That's why she abandoned you. I was getting older, more independent, asking harder questions. I reminded her of Marcus, of her failure as a mother, so she found a way to start over with a clean slate. Emma looked up at me. "Your son and Ben represented her chance to be the perfect mother she couldn't be for Marcus and me." The psychological profile was becoming clearer. Vicky wasn't just selfish or manipulative. She was a woman running from a guilt so profound that it had reshaped her entire personality. But that understanding didn't excuse what she'd done to Emma. "The fake death certificate," I said slowly. "That wasn't just about keeping you away. That was about convincing herself you were gone, like Marcus." "Exactly. In her mind, if I was dead, then she couldn't fail me the way she failed him. She could preserve the fantasy that she was protecting me by staying away." Emma reached across the table and touched my hand. "Mrs. Caldwell, I need you to understand something. I didn't come here for revenge or money, or even necessarily for a relationship with my half-brother. I came here because I'm terrified that when Ben stops being useful to her image, she'll find a way to erase him too." "What do you mean?" "What happens when Ben makes a mistake, when he does something that threatens her perfect family image? What happens when he gets older and starts asking uncomfortable questions, the way I did?" Emma's voice was urgent now. "My mother's pattern isn't just abandonment, it's elimination. She doesn't just leave people behind, she makes sure they can never come back to haunt her." The full horror of what Emma was suggesting settled over me like a shroud. Vicky wasn't just a woman who'd made a terrible mistake. She was someone whose guilt had transformed her into something predatory, someone who would sacrifice anyone, including her own children, to maintain her psychological equilibrium. "We have to tell them," I said finally. Emma nodded. "But they won't believe us. Not without proof, and not while she's had weeks to prepare her defense." "Then we'll have to show them," I said. my mind already working on a plan. All of them, together, where she can't control the narrative. The next morning, I called Mike and suggested a family barbecue for the following Saturday. I think it's time we all sat down and talked through what happened at the restaurant. I told him, all this tension isn't good for anyone, especially Ben. Mike was reluctant at first. Vicky had been pushing for a period of cooling off, where we avoided family gatherings. But Ben had been asking questions, and Mike could see that his son was struggling with the revelations about his mother's past. "Maybe you're right," Mike said finally. "But Mom, I need your word that you won't ambush Vicky again. No more videos. No more investigations. Just family trying to work things out." "I give you my word," I said, and I meant it. There would be no ambush this time. Emma's presence would be revelation enough. Emma spent the week in a local hotel, using the time to prepare herself mentally for what would undoubtedly be the most difficult conversation of her life. We met twice during those days, going over what she wanted to say, what questions she anticipated, how she wanted to present herself. I don't want to be seen as the poor, abandoned daughter looking for sympathy, she told me. I want them to see me as I am someone who survived and built a life despite everything, someone who's strong enough to tell the truth without falling apart. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical Pacific Northwest weather that made everything feel heavy and uncertain. Emma and I sat in my car outside Mike and Vicky's house for several minutes, watching through the windows as my family moved around inside, preparing for what they thought would be a healing gathering. "Are you ready for this?" I asked Emma. She smoothed down her simple blue dress, the kind of outfit someone wears when they want to look respectable but can't afford anything fancy. "No, but I don't think I'll ever be ready, so we might as well get it over with." I knocked on the front door instead of using my key, a small acknowledgement that my status in this house had changed. When Mike opened the door, his face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, and finally a carefully controlled neutrality. "Mom, I wasn't sure you were coming." "I brought someone I'd like you to meet," I said, stepping aside so he could see Emma clearly. Mike's eyes widened as he took in her familiar features. Even someone determined to disbelieve the truth couldn't miss the family resemblance. "This is Emma Carter," I said clearly. "Your stepdaughter." For a moment, Mike just stood there, mouth slightly open, staring at the young woman on his doorstep, who shared his son's eyes and his wife's bone structure. "Hello," Emma said simply. "I've been looking forward to meeting you." From somewhere behind Mike, I heard a glass shatter against the kitchen floor, followed by Vicky's voice calling out in false cheerfulness, "Mike, who's at the door?" "I think," Emma said quietly, "it's time for a real family reunion." The moment Emma stepped into Mike's living room, the carefully orchestrated healing gathering transformed into something else entirely. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as relatives who'd been debating my version of events for weeks found themselves face to face with living proof of Vicky's deception. Vicky stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, a dish towel still in her hands from cleaning up whatever she'd dropped when she heard Emma's name. Her face had gone completely white, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely scared. "Emma," Ben's voice came from the couch where he'd been sitting with his girlfriend Ashley. He stood up slowly, studying the young woman beside me with obvious fascination. You're my sister." "Half-sister," Emma corrected gently. "But yes." The resemblance between them was unmistakable now that they were in the same room. Both had inherited Mike's warm brown eyes and expressive eyebrows, though Emma's were more defined from years of careful grooming on a tight budget. "I don't understand," Mike said, his voice strained. "Emma, if you're really Vicky's daughter, why didn't you contact us before now?" Emma's laugh was soft but bitter. Because until 2 weeks ago, I thought my mother was dead. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the coffee maker gurgling in the kitchen. Around the room, family members who'd spent weeks choosing sides found themselves recalibrating everything they thought they knew. "That's not possible," Vicky finally managed, her voice high and thin. "Emma, sweetheart, you know that's not true. You were angry when I remarried, and you chose to cut contact with me." "No," Emma said firmly, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I was 15 years old when you signed papers terminating your parental rights. I was 17 when I aged out of foster care with no family support. And I was 20 when I hired an investigator to find you, only to be told you died in a car accident." She pulled a folder from her backpack and handed it to Mike. "These are copies of all the documents, the court papers you signed, the fake death certificate someone provided to the investigator I hired, even receipts showing payments made to ensure that story would hold up if anyone came looking." Mike's hands shook as he opened the folder. I watched his face change as he read through the evidence of his wife's systematic deception. "You paid someone to fake your own death." His voice was barely above a whisper. "Mike, you have to understand," Vicky said desperately, moving toward him with her hands outstretched. "The situation was complicated." "I was getting straight A's," Emma interrupted, her voice cutting through Vicky's fabrication like a knife. "I was working a part-time job to help my elderly grandmother pay for groceries. The only thing I was going through was trying to understand why my mother disappeared from my life without explanation." She turned to address the room, her voice growing more confident as she spoke. "I want everyone here to understand something. I didn't come here for money or revenge or to break up anyone's family. I came here because I discovered that my mother, who I grieved for 3 years believing she was dead, has been living a completely different life while I struggled to survive on my own." Ben stepped closer to her, his young face serious with the weight of understanding. "What has your life been like since she left?" Emma met his eyes steadily. "I've worked 2 jobs for the past 5 years to put myself through community college. I live in a studio apartment that costs most of my income. I've had no family support, no safety net, no one to call when things got difficult." She paused, her voice softening. "But I've also learned that I'm stronger than I ever thought possible." "Oh, sweetheart," Amanda spoke up from across the room, her voice full of genuine sympathy. "We had no idea." "Because you were never meant to know," Emma replied. "My mother made sure of that." Vicky was backing toward the kitchen, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. "You don't understand," she kept repeating. "None of you understand how complicated the situation was." "Then explain it to us," Mike said, his voice hard. "Explain how abandoning a 15-year-old and then faking your own death was the right thing to do." That's when something inside Vicky finally snapped. The facade she'd maintained for 15 years cracked completely, revealing the damaged woman underneath. She reminded me of Marcus. The words exploded from her like they'd been trapped under pressure for years. Every day, she reminded me of what I'd done, of how I'd failed. The room went dead silent. Even Emma looked confused. "Who's Marcus?" Ben asked quietly. Vicky looked around the room like a trapped animal, realizing she'd revealed more than she'd intended. But there was no going back now. "Marcus was my son," she said, her voice breaking. "Emma's older brother. He died when he was 15 because I was too drunk to pick him up from school. He tried to walk home in the rain and got hit by a car." The confession hung in the air like a toxic cloud. I watched as the pieces clicked into place for everyone in the room, the perfectionism, the control, the need to erase anything that reminded her of her failures. "Marcus would have been 26 now," Emma said softly. "He was my best friend, my protector. When he died, I lost the only person who really loved me." "I loved you," Vicky said desperately. "But every time I looked at you, I saw him. I saw what I'd done. I couldn't live with that guilt and still be the mother you needed. So you erased me instead, Emma said with devastating simplicity. You chose your own comfort over your child's well-being. Mike set the folder down on the coffee table and looked at his wife with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger, not disappointment, but complete recognition of who she really was. "Get out," he said quietly. "Mike, please, get out of my house, get out of my life, get away from my family." "Your family?" Vicky's voice turned vicious. "Half of everything in this house is mine, half of your assets, half of your retirement. You can't just throw me out." "Actually," Mike said with grim satisfaction, "I can. The prenup you insisted on works both ways. Vicky, if either spouse commits fraud or engages in behavior that materially misrepresents their character, the marriage can be dissolved with no financial obligations." Vicky's face went pale. "You wouldn't—" "Abandoning your child and faking your own death to hide it from your new family seems like material misrepresentation to me." Mike continued, "I'll have my lawyer contact you about the divorce proceedings." I watched Vicky look around the room, searching for even one sympathetic face. She found none. Even the relatives who'd been most willing to give her the benefit of the doubt were now staring at her with undisguised revulsion. But Vicky had one last card to play. "You think you're so righteous," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "But you have no idea what you're throwing away. Emma doesn't want a family, she wants revenge. She wants to destroy what we built because she's jealous of the life Ben had." "Is that true?" Ben asked, turning to Emma with genuine concern. Emma looked at him for a long moment, then shook her head. "I don't want to destroy anything. Ben, I just want you to know the truth about who your mother really is, so you can protect yourself if you ever become inconvenient to her image." The silence that followed was broken by Vicky's bitter laughter. "Protect himself from me. I'm his mother. I've given him everything, the best schools, the best opportunities, unconditional love and support, the same way you supported Emma." Mike's voice was ice cold. That was different. "How?" Ben stepped forward, his young face hard with anger I'd never seen before. "How is it different? Because I happened to be born at a more convenient time in your life." Vicky opened her mouth to respond, then seemed to realize there was no good answer to that question. "Ben," she said instead, her voice taking on a pleading tone, "you're my son. Nothing will ever change that. I love you more than life itself." "You loved Marcus too," Emma said quietly, "until loving him became too painful. Then you let guilt turn you into someone who could abandon a child to preserve your own peace of mind. I never abandoned you. I made sure you had a home with your grandmother, a 78-year-old woman with arthritis who could barely take care of herself," Emma shot back. "And when she died 2 years later, where were you? When I aged out of foster care with nothing, where was the mother who supposedly loved me enough to make the difficult decision to let me go?" Vicky had no answer for that, because there was no answer. The truth was that she'd erased Emma so completely from her life that she'd never bothered to check if the girl was even alive. Mike stood up slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. "Vicky, I want you to pack a bag and leave, tonight. We'll figure out the rest through lawyers." "Mike, please, we can work through this. We can go to counseling. We can't work through 15 years of lies." Mike said firmly, "We can't work through the fact that you're capable of abandoning your own child, and we can't work through the fact that you made me an accessory to that abandonment by marrying me under false pretenses." As Vicky left the room to pack, The rest of us sat in stunned silence, processing what had just happened. Family gatherings would never be the same again. Our understanding of who we were as a family had been fundamentally altered. But as difficult as the truth was, it was better than living with Vicky's carefully constructed lies. "What happens now?" Ben asked finally. Emma looked at him with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "I don't know. I guess that depends on whether you want a sister in your life." Ben smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him all evening. "I've always wanted a sister. The half part is just biology. Sisters are about choice. Then I choose you too," Emma said softly. 6 months later, I stood in my kitchen making Sunday dinner for a larger crowd than I'd cooked for in years. The sound of laughter drifted in from the living room, where Emma and Ben were engaged in one of their increasingly frequent debates about social policy. Despite, or perhaps because of their different life experiences, they'd developed a sibling relationship that was both protective and competitive. Emma had transferred to a school closer to us, and Mike was helping her with tuition. It wasn't charity she'd insisted on working part-time to contribute to her expenses, but it was family support of the kind she'd never had before. Ben had convinced her to move into the guest room at his apartment, claiming he needed a study partner for the bar exam, though we all knew he just wanted to make sure his newly discovered sister felt welcomed and protected. The divorce had been finalized with surprising speed once Mike's lawyer presented evidence of Vicky's deception. The prenup she'd insisted on, designed to protect her assets in case Mike turned out to be after her money, had instead protected him when her deception came to light. Vicky had disappeared from our lives as thoroughly as she'd once disappeared from Emma's, leaving behind only forwarding information for her lawyer. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd moved back to Portland and was getting therapy, which I hoped was true. Understanding the psychological roots of her behavior didn't excuse what she'd done, but it did make me hope she might find a way to live with her guilt without destroying other people's lives. The crisis had stripped away all the polite pretenses and careful social maneuvering that had characterized our family interactions for years. We were closer now, more honest with each other, more willing to have difficult conversations. Even my relationship with Rebecca had improved. She'd apologized for doubting me initially and had become one of Emma's strongest supporters. "Grandma Maggie," Emma appeared in my kitchen doorway, holding a bottle of wine. "Mike sent me to ask if you need help with anything." Oh, I smiled at the title she'd chosen for me. Not Mrs. Caldwell, not Margaret, but Grandma, a designation that acknowledged her place in our family structure while respecting the relationship she'd built with my son and grandson. "I think we're almost ready," I said, checking the roast in the oven. "How are you settling in at school?" "Better than I expected." She leaned against the counter, relaxed in a way I'd never seen during those first tense meetings. "It's strange having people who care about whether I succeed or fail. I'm still getting used to it." "Good strange or bad strange?" "Definitely good." She paused, then added quietly, "Thank you for everything, for investigating, for confronting her, for bringing me into this family. I know it wasn't easy." I studied her face, seeing not just the young woman she'd become, but glimpses of the frightened 15-year-old who'd been abandoned, the determined 17-year-old who'd aged out of foster care, the hopeful 20-year-old who'd grieved for a mother who was never really dead. "You did the hard part," I told her. "You survived. You built a life for yourself with no help from anyone. All I did was make sure the truth came to light." "All you did," Emma repeated with a smile, "was save me from spending the rest of my life believing I wasn't worth loving." From the dining room, I could hear Mike and Ben debating something with the passionate intensity that seemed to run in our family. The sound of their voices, now joined by Emma's laugh, filled my house with a warmth I hadn't felt in years. Vicky had tried to erase Emma from existence to protect her perfect life from the inconvenience of her past choices. But in the end, her cruelty had only brought our family closer together. Emma wasn't a liability to be hidden. She was the missing piece we'd never known we needed. As we sat down to dinner that Sunday, I looked around the table at my son, my grandson, and the granddaughter I'd gained through tragedy and truth. This wasn't the family Vicky had tried to build through lies and manipulation. This was better. This was real. The perfect revenge, I realized, wasn't destroying Vicky's life. It was building something beautiful from the wreckage she'd left behind. Emma had survived and thrived despite abandonment. Ben had learned to value truth over comfortable illusions. Mike had discovered that love built on lies isn't love at all. And I had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to let someone else's lies become the truth. Now, as I watched my family share stories and dreams around my dinner table, I understood that the best revenge isn't getting even, it's getting better. It's taking the broken pieces of what someone tried to destroy and building something stronger, more honest, and more beautiful than what came before. Emma caught my eye across the table and raised her wine glass in a small, private toast. To truth, her expression seemed to say, to family, to the courage it takes to face hard realities and choose love anyway. I raised my own glass in response, and in that moment, I knew that whatever Vicky had intended when she tried to erase her daughter from the world, she had failed completely. Emma hadn't just survived, she had found her way home.